Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Market Access and Commercialization webinar. This is part of our webinar series to really help people who might be interested in working with the energy networks and getting involved in the Strategic Innovation Fund to understand what the role of the energy networks are, how you can start to access this market from an innovator or a third-party point of view, commercialize your idea, and also access funding. So today we'll be focusing on the market access and commercialization point of view. My name is David Richardson. I'm Head of Innovation for the Strategic Innovation Fund at Innovate UK. And we've got three main webinar agenda items for you today. The first is really understanding what the journey for an innovator or another organization needs to go on to be able to take an idea right the way through to market and commercialization. Looking at the various suitable routes to markets within the energy network sector, there are a few different ways that you can get your foot in the door with these organizations. And then the final part is we're going to give you a few examples of successful innovations that have now been incorporated into networks business as usual operations, and really show you that there is quite a substantial business opportunity if you can navigate the sector correctly. And we're here to help you do that. So thanks to the Innovate team for putting this together in Carbon Trust, and I'll now hand over to Lily.
Great, thanks David, and thanks everybody for joining today. So I'm going to set the scene by talking about the journey to commercialization that most companies will follow when they enter the sector. And the reason it's important to frame it as this journey is that I think, as everybody will acknowledge, you can have a wonderful technical idea and solution, but unfortunately there's many hurdles, both commercial, regulatory, financial, that you must get through in order to reach scale. So I'm going to talk through what it looks like at a high level, and then some of the key considerations, and hand over to colleagues who can talk about how you go about practically entering the sector. The way the Carbon Trust thinks about journey to commercialization within the energy sector is using a term from the software industry called Valley of Death. And what this means is it's a period where an organization has raised some funds, but has yet to either become profitable or reach the next stage of funding before, and they're kind of in a funding or period where they're trying to develop something but haven't quite reached financial stability. And even if you are a software company working within energy or energy networks, it is a regulated sector and it can be a long journey, and there's many things to think about along the road. So I'll talk through this journey, and then we'll dive in on the next slide to some of the more details. So obviously you start off in a kind of research and development stage where you have a very nascent idea, and at this point it's really about that kind of tech transfer often, or and securing early capital and persuading investors of the fact that you do have an end market, so not just a technology, but there is a pathway to scale, which is a pretty difficult thing to do, but as we'll hear from others, there's lots of potential. The next stage is a prototype where you will take that idea and form a first version of a product. And here it's really about making sure you have the right people to do that, and also the right sorts of partnerships in terms of suppliers. The next stage is all about development, and that's really identifying a customer that will take that first bet on you. Something that we see in the sector often is one of the challenges is overcoming what is a perceived risk. And so finding partners is really the focus of this stage. The next is demonstration, rather, which is often referred to as the death by pilots phase, where organizations will be demonstrating with multiple different organizations, and the nuances of each customer will have to be met. And then the deployment is scaling beyond into full scale deployment into new markets and geographies. So there's a whole host of things that will be considered throughout this journey. Themes like making sure you've got the right team, making sure that you have enough funding and the right sorts of funding, the right sorts of partnerships, whether it be customers or suppliers in place, and understanding an ever evolving policy landscape. Can we go to the next slide, please? And I'll dive into a couple of the key points. So one of the things that we often see when we see grant applications or approaches to venture capital is that organizations tend to focus on the underlying technical aspects of their offering rather than considering a kind of a multitude of other factors. So what we've got on this slide is a collection of the considerations that we think are the most important at each growth stage. I'm not unfortunately going to be able to have time to go through them, but I believe the slides might be shared afterwards so that you can kind of see some of the nuances at each stage. The four I wanted to highlight are one is that right from the get-go that people are super important, both from a practical perspective of making sure you've got the right people on board, but also it's one of the first things that venture capitalists look for. The second is obviously working in a highly complex regulatory environment for good reason, but that can be challenging for organisations from the beginning. The two pieces that I've put in bold under product development, under the product development stage, are to do with, as everybody will be aware, taking it beyond describing what your product can do to why would a customer buy what I'm offering, but not just that, but understanding how customers actually operate and make their decisions. So understanding quite complex procurement cycles, and how they approach innovation. So those are the four key things that I wanted to highlight on this slide. There's many more. I will hand over now to Laura to talk about more specifics within the energy network sector and available routes to market. But happy to take any questions at the end. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Lily. So now we'll come on to a bit more of a focus of how you can actually sell your products and services to the networks, what that end goal is that Lily mentioned from your scale-up process. There are four main routes to market in the energy network space, all kind of different routes depending on exactly what your big idea is. The first of these is commercial participation in ancillary services and flexibility markets. These are most relevant to the electricity networks and are used to assist in managing system stability, balancing supply and demand, and resolving the bottlenecks in the network. They consist of either like competitive tenders or auctions that are aimed at generators, storage providers, demand side response, basically anyone who's connected to the networks to help meet the needs of the system operators or the network operators around these core areas. The second of the big routes to market is sales of network assets and infrastructure directly to the network companies. This is more similar to what you might see in other sectors, where you're selling a physical thing via a fairly standard procurement route into the network, and you need to meet certain supplier obligations along the way. The third main route is service contracts for licenses, for digital platforms, models, forecasting tools. The networks generally procure these tools by third parties, and they may pay a license fee for this, or they may pay a third party to develop a new tool or model directly for their needs as well, and pay on a kind of one-off basis, or maybe with a kind of maintenance contract in there as well. And the last route is non-network commercialization routes. So within the scope of things like the Strategic Innovation Fund, we're looking at any idea that can give benefits to the network in terms of reduced cost savings or carbon savings in its operation. However, you as an innovator may actually find that your end consumer that you're selling to isn't the network itself. There are other ways that you could be commercializing and kind of indirectly providing network benefits to the wider system. You're still very much within the scope of the SIF, but your target market at the end might not be the network company itself. So a bit more detail on each of these routes. Firstly, on the flexibility markets. We see flexibility markets both in the distribution side of things and on the transmission network side of things. These are new terms. Go back and have a look at the webinar we did a couple of weeks ago on the introduction to the roles and responsibilities in the sector. On the distribution side of things, the distribution network operators are currently transitioning to a more active role in managing their networks, and over the last few years have started to procure flexibility from generators, storage, consumers connected to their network, largely asking them to help turn up or turn down to help manage constraints on the network. These are quite specific in location, so it might be under a particular primary substation serving, for example, a small town, and the scope of that particular procurement cycle of either a market or a tender will be very location specific and targeted at those specific areas where you're seeing constraints. There's 4 main types of service that are procured, and these are largely consistent across each of the distribution network operators. And these fall under sustain, secure, dynamic, and restore. Each of them have slightly different purposes and work over slightly different timescales, and therefore have different requirements associated with them that any supplier will need to meet. Currently, almost all of them are procured initially months to years in advance, with different payment rates kind of agreed at that time. But you will, for some of these, you'll get a notification closer to real time, so either a week advance or a day ahead, or even like at point of dispatch, saying we need you to turn up or turn down in these particular points in time to help manage this particular issue on the network. For these services, capacity is actually quite low in terms of what your minimum capacity is needed. And this means that it's actually quite a good early route to entry for a company that is providing flexibility services. There are quite low barriers to entry here. However, there are specific obligations that you might need to be meeting on a contractual side of things, both kind of technical requirements in terms of providing the service, such as metering and communication requirements, and also some supplier commitments as well. And you might need specific kind of liability insurance. So yeah, make sure that you have a look at all of the details that are kind of very easily found on the network operator websites. Okay. Very similar at the ESO side of things, that we have a whole range of flexibility and ancillary services to assist with system operation. We can generally group these into 5 main buckets. So kind of frequency and reserve, which are targeted at maintaining system frequency and kind of balancing supply and demand in real time. We've got system stability, looking at some pretty technical components of the network and making sure that they stay within their specific limits, such as within voltage and system inertia. We've got voltage specific services. We've got thermal constraint management, which are quite a new range of services. And we've got restoration at the end, which is around what if that worst case scenario happened and we did have either a full or a partial blackout of the system. How do we restart it with the technologies that we have to hand? Similar principle applies to the distribution networks, that is all of these different markets are kind of open to the generators, storage providers, specific aggregators and flexibility providers, and end consumers to participate in. But they do all have some very wide-ranging different technical requirements associated with them as well. Under each of these different topic areas, there are a range of different services that may be either better suited or less suited for your particular technology type and the services you can provide based on these technical requirements. And this range of services helps the ESO in terms of managing the specific system needs they have in the kind of most cost optimal way for them to do so. As I mentioned, each of these services have different requirements. Here's just a subset of them, but there might be some requirements around the minimum capacity that you can bid into these auctions. There's requirements about the response times that you have to meet, the length of response that you might need to provide, and the contract length as well. So what length of time might you need to be available for, and how frequently you might need to bid into these auctions to get new contracts. There's pros and cons of this, obviously, from a risk perspective. Sometimes it's good to have a longer contract, and sometimes it means you can be way more responsive in terms of what you're bidding in if you're on quite a short turnaround. As we're moving to a decarbonised system, we're seeing a wide range of technologies kind of starting to participate in these. Historically, all our flexibility has come from thermal generators, so conventional sources of generation. But we're recently seeing more of a transition to, for example, battery storage, providing a lot of our frequency response needs, and demand response also coming in online to a far greater extent to help manage those peaks and troughs in generation and helping manage constraints in the network. As time goes on, we expect to see far more wide-ranging, new, innovative providers providing, especially on our newer system needs, such as stability and black start capabilities. Okay, on to B and C. So our routes to market involving infrastructure, assets, and software sales. So this is a more typical procurement route to what you might see in other sectors. There's some clear steps that any supplier needs to go through to bid into this. So firstly, registration of your company's details on either the network's own website or a dedicated procurement platform. These platforms do range from network to network, but some common ones you might hear about are Achilles, Jagger, Ariba, but largely they provide a similar sort of function of just registering supplier interest and different things. Then there's often a pre-qualification step, and this varies depending on the equipment or service that you're providing. There might be specific accreditations or pre-qualification conditions that you might need to meet. And again, a lot of the networks actually kind of outsource the management of this to a third-party platform, and Achilles is kind of the most common one here. So you might hear the acronym UVDB for this process, and be aware that there is a small fee for registering for this platform, but it is on the very low end of the spectrum. You'll also have to be aware of things like sustainability procurement codes, which are very common in the sector. The suppliers into the networks often have to meet certain criteria around having net zero targets and sustainability targets, alongside wider ranging things such as human rights, labour right policies, and insurance and liability minimum thresholds as well. Once you're all nicely registered, you'll start seeing notifications via these procurement platforms of any competitions or requests for tenders that the networks are circulating for providing different products that they're in need of. This could be software, or it could be infrastructure and physical hardware as well. Suppliers can then submit their responses to the tender via the procurement platform, and suppliers will then be notified of their success or not once the networks have reviewed all of the different bids that are coming in for providing that particular service. So yeah, very typical to what you might see in some other sectors, but do check out all of those different requirements on the suppliers that might be specific to our sector in particular. And lastly, those non-network commercialization routes. So just to emphasize again, even if your product isn't specifically targeting the networks as your end user, you may well be providing benefits to the wider gas or electricity systems, and in which case you're very much within scope of the Strategic Innovation Fund. However, as you think about scaling up, think about who you're actually selling that product to, how you can package in some of those network benefits. This could be sales directly to end consumers, either like domestic or business. You could be targeting the energy suppliers, the flexibility providers, the technology providers, the batteries, aggregators, and providing services to them to enhance their products. Or you could be a component sales to one of the network suppliers in terms of suppliers of, for example, substations and transformers, on how they can make their services more efficient. But yes, all of you are in scope, so please do consider your ideas in that context. Okay, that's all I had time for at this point on routes to market. But as Lily says, please do ask us some questions, and we can follow up after this webinar as well with any responses. Next, we think is way more interesting for you to hear directly from the SMEs who have already done this journey ahead of you. And we've got 3 great speakers lined up for you. So firstly, I'd like to hand over to Matthew Bilson, who's Director of Policy at Picklo. Matthew, are you there?
I am. Hopefully you can see and hear me okay.
Yes, we can. Over to you.
Oops. And you'll move the slides for me, Laura.
Yes.
So I'll probably skip this one. I'm assuming most people are familiar with what flexibility is. So I'll, for interest of time, perhaps you can move to the next one, Laura. So I'll just briefly explain what Picklo is. So Picklo is the name of the company I work for. Picklo is essentially a software company. We provide a software platform, a virtual marketplace that matches buyers of flexibility, who are typically the system operators, so the network companies, with sellers of flexibility. So the sellers are usually on the right, who are asset owners. They can be anything from Tesla's charging point network could be a form of flexibility. We have combined heat and power units which can sell their flexibility. We have again EV charging point aggregators and other aggregators like Octopus, who are also selling flexibility through Picklo back to the network operators. So we don't own any hardware ourselves in Picklo. We move to the next slide, Laura. So this slide really is talking about, I suppose, the main focus of how we've grown and Picklo's journey. So the company was founded in 2013 by 3 co-founders, James, Alice and Andy. And actually they started with a different proposal. So they were focusing on peer-to-peer energy trading. However, after a few years, they realized that the market, the maturity, the business model just wasn't quite there. So around 2017, they actually pivoted to a new proposal, a new concept, which is the flexibility marketplaces, and that's kind of where the company's really grown since then. So really what kicked off that growth was the company received first one grant from, I think it was DEC, and then a second grant from Bayes after over about an 18-month period, 2-year period. And that funding, which it's only one of the grants, the scale was around 400,000. That helped develop the proposal, the idea of this platform. So it helped pay for software developers to come to Piclo and develop the platform. And around the same time, we got one of our first sort of partners, so UKPout Networks, agreed to kind of come into the grant-funded pilot to see what Piclo is doing. And then since then, it's very much grown as kind of the slides that were first showing around kind of the journey of innovation. Piclo is a good example of that. So we had the innovation funding that helped develop the proof of concept. And then the company, we were able to demonstrate to other clients, so other network companies, that we had a robust product that we could sell, and that it was a reliable product. They could rely on Piclo and the product to deliver a service for them. So that's when, around 2019, is when we started picking up more commercial contracts, so moving away from the innovation funding to kind of standard commercial contracts. And the type, I think, is point C in Laura's previous slide. So the type of contract, the route to market for us was a service contract to these network companies. So understanding who they were, what the problems they were having, what they needed to buy. And then again, so since around kind of 2021, we then managed to start expanding outside the UK. So that for us, the same business model, so targeting other network companies who need flexibility, and then offering them the service to basically say Piclo can help deal with all the problems of getting that flexibility for you. And we kind of most recently, around beginning of in spring, we successfully did another fundraise of equity investment to continue to grow the company. And then also picked up a contract from ESO, so the transmission system operator, to help create a new market for them, which was the local constraint market, which I think Laura showed on one of her slides, on the different types of markets out there. If you move to the next slide, Laura. So then this is kind of talking a little bit more about the kind of the steps we went through and some of what was needed, I suppose. So for when the company was very much started, the co-founder James actually moved from Scotland down to London because he felt London, bear in mind this is 10 years ago, London had a better network of climate thinking tech companies. So got talking to people, got seed funding from private investors. So that helped set the company up. As I said, we then managed to get innovation funding from the government, which was very useful and needed, and helped develop the core product. But then also what's really helped Piclo is the kind of the wider policy landscape, where, and this is where we think the UK was leading, or is leading, is when the UK ministry, so what was DEC and Bayes, did a very much joint policy approach with the regulator, with Ofgem, and that really helped encourage the clients, the network companies, to really think about flexibility and how they were going to do that. So that sort of created the market for us, which then Piclo was able to step into and to sell a proposal, an idea to the DNOs, which is how we've grown so much. And we still think the UK is the best market for this kind of thing in the world. If you move to the next slide, Laura. So then kind of thinking about some of the things we wish we'd known, and also talking about the future growth. So one of the things we think about is how we are going to move beyond the early DNO adopters. So people often talk about early adopters in technology. We feel the UK DNOs have been actually some of the earliest adopters of that. We're seeing slightly more caution from some of the European DNOs and elsewhere. So it's really thinking much more about how we sell to those clients, what we need to show them, how the regulatory landscape may need to evolve. The other thing which I think Laura did mention is, yes, because we sell to the network companies, they are all regulated utilities and networks. Therefore, the timescales can be a little unpredictable, can be a little bit slow, which if you're a growing company can be slightly challenging. So thinking about how you're going to manage your cash flow, how you're going to manage your people, manage your costs, etc., is very important, and anticipating actually that sometimes these timescales can be quite long. And the final point I'll probably make is around market complexity, where if you feel bamboozled by the slide I think Laura showed on the different types of electricity markets around thermal and frequency response, etc., you're not alone. But if that's kind of concerning, that you try and move to the US. So the US market is, in our experience, even more complex because you have a state-by-state approach, which are all slightly different. So again, being prepared to invest time and people into trying to understand how the different electricity markets fit together, and then what your proposal will be, I think is important as well. And if you move to the next slide, Laura, I think this is my last slide. So then this is just a kind of an illustration of the success story of how much we've grown really in the last 5 years, where we focus on this particular aspect of flexibility. So we're now worldwide and we're picking up more clients. There might be an announcement in a couple of weeks, a couple of days time about another client we've picked up. So we're very, very excited about what we have to offer. And I think I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks very much, Matthew. Really good to hear about how Piccolo has been progressing, and it's great to see you expanding into the international markets as well. Okay, now on to a very different type of technology. So I'd like to hand over to Samuel Jupe, who's Commercial Director at Nortec Management Limited, to talk about some of the hardware solutions that they've been developing for network operators. So Samuel, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Laura. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide. So very briefly, I'm going to give a quick overview of Nortec's hardware technologies, the various implementation directions where we've funded ideas through into implementation, at the key stages in that implementation journey, our engagement and approach with the network companies, and some lessons learnt from the hardware side. This very much complements Laura's earlier slides, looking at some of the more traditional procurement routes. We're registered on Achilles and a lot of the distribution network operator standard procurement platforms. So if we can move on to the next slide. Nortec sells a range of technologies, and for any SMEs out there, one key bit of advice I'd say, as soon as possible, if you can diversify your portfolio of offerings, you help to manage a number of risks, both technical and commercial risks associated with any particular product line not necessarily working as expected or coming to fruition. Nortec has 4 key offerings, fault passage indicators, and that will be the focus for today's focus on commercialization. But we also sell micro RTUs to help monitor volts and amps out on the network, and a number of different analogs and data points. We also have a platform called the Envoy, which is a robust platform that allows for algorithms to be embedded, for example, for monitoring within substations, doing protocol conversion of traditional equipment types like power quality monitors. And we bring all that data through into a platform called iHost, which exists within the SCADA environment for a number of the network operators across the UK and indeed across the world. But as I say, I'll focus on the fault passage indicators, and if we can move on to the next slide. So in terms of funding ideas into implementation, the products that you can see on this slide, the NX44 on the left and the smart navigators, which are on the overhead line network on the right. 10 years ago, they didn't exist in the marketplace. And the fault passage indication solutions for the network operators were very much manual intensive operations. So they would give the fault passage indicators that exist in electrical substations, would give a little indication, a local indication, and in order to find out if there was a cable fault, for example, in your street, the network operator would drive physically from substation to substation to identify which fault passage indicators were flagging to say that they'd seen the fault, and then you can rule out which parts of the network haven't seen the fault because the FPIs don't give an indication. We have targeted, alongside diversifying the portfolio of products, we have targeted a number of different funding streams in order to bring the innovation through to commercialization. And in particular, what we've brought to the marketplace is the remote communication of the fault passage indication signals, so that the data that says whether or not there's been an electrical cable or an overhead line fault no longer requires the staff to drive to site, but all that data comes up through into the control room for the distribution network operator. They're then able to collate the information and to deploy staff to site directly to where the fault is, rather than having to drive from substation to substation. I would say very much the Network Innovation Allowance has been a fundamental pivot stone and a fundamental enabler for us as a company working with the distribution network operators. And I'll go on to describe some of the steps in that journey. But as I say on this slide, 10 years ago, these products didn't exist. And through various funding streams, private investment from the network operators, the Network Innovation Allowance, the Network Innovation Competition, which is now superseded by SIF, they've all been key enablers to us to allow innovation to come to fruition. And if I can move on to the next slide. So some ideas in terms of the key stages in the journey that we've been through. First of all, that initial innovation spark, identifying the need case and opportunity. And in fact, there's a lot of different techniques that can be done to do the gap analysis and to very robustly identify market opportunities. But one of the key things that we did as a company was we co-created the solution. So we worked very closely with the network operators, listened to their needs, talked about the business case, but understood what some of their problems and key headaches were at the time. And so we co-created the solutions with the network operators. And in doing so, we very much engaged the end users right at the very start of the process so that they could be the adopters of the technology at the end. Using the backing of the network operators and indeed through the Network Innovation Allowance, we were able to secure funding, putting forward strong business cases. And I'll go on to talk about the business case for the fault passage indicators on the next slide. A key thing that allows innovation to come to fruition is where you put in place robust project delivery and testing of the solutions. Once again, as Laura mentioned, the various platforms for procurement, some of the questions the network operators will be asking is around the evidence of the testing of the product and so forth. And so having kind of robust project delivery, robust testing regimes are key enablers for innovation to come to fruition. And then linking back to that early user engagement and adoption, one of the things that we've done is worked very closely with the network operators to help facilitate their business adoption policies, and indeed with their backing to help transfer technologies from one network operator to another. And the next slide, please. So just very briefly, this example of finding fault passage, finding electrical faults using fault passage indicators. The key business case in this case is that the network operators are regulated by Ofgem to minimize the number of interruptions and for how long the electrical interruptions happen to customers. And that incentive mechanism is very, very well established, but it is a key performance indicator for the network operators. And indeed, if anything that the network operators can do to improve the reliability of their networks unlocks revenue streams for them. This becomes more and more fundamental now as we look to decarbonize a number of different vectors like heating and transport through the electricity systems. So alongside monitoring and flexibility markets, a fundamental building block is to have reliable and increased reliability in our electricity networks. And if we move on to the next slide. One of the key things that we've now done with the network operators is, rather than the network operators being reactive to when faults occur, we've developed the technology further such that we can actually identify defects in parts of the network, in cables and overhead lines, prior to the fault occurring and prior to interruptions to customers. And this is live results from earlier this year, where we installed our fault passage indication equipment enhanced to be able to detect disturbances in the network. And in this case, we were able to give National Grid electricity distribution 2 key locations where we could detect disturbances within the network. You can see example waveforms of the disturbances that were captured by the devices. And after providing this information to National Grid electricity distribution, they deployed helicopters to survey the overhead lines in this case, and found examples of the tree infringement that you can see in the photos on the right-hand side of the screen. And by then proactively removing that tree growth, the interruptions to customers have been mitigated. And if we move on to the next slide, please. So just some key tips in terms of how we engage with the network companies. Alongside the registration on the procurement platforms, one of the things that we've taken very seriously is the accreditations to the various ISO standards, quality, environment, information security and health and safety. And in particular, I'd say the ISO 27001 information security management standard is going to be such a key enabler for anybody entering the marketplace with the energy companies, particularly as it's such a critical part of our national infrastructure and will become even more critical in the future. We've worked with our network companies to identify innovation solutions, with the network company at the heart of the solution. Worked very closely with them to demonstrate the reliability and quality of the product, making sure that alongside that they're given excellent customer satisfaction, responding very quickly to any queries that arise, but also helping to articulate to them and to their senior management how the technologies are delivering year by year cost savings, which then allow them to operate according to their sort of key performance indicators, but also allowed Nortec to grow profitably year on year, as we have been doing since I joined the company about a decade ago. And very much we focus on the aftercare, so that we're not just supplying the hardware to the distribution network operator, but we are providing them with ongoing support after that hardware has been adopted. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. Just some very quick key lessons learned from systems integration, where you are integrating hardware into the network. The networks hitherto haven't necessarily been monitored across the range of different voltage levels, and there's certainly some very quirky behavior that can be identified. In this particular case, when we installed one of our fault passage indicators, we're able to see the vectorial electrical signals for the voltage and current and they didn't make any sense from a kind of electrical point of view in terms of where we would have expected the voltage and the current vectors to be relative to one another. This was using some existing equipment that existed within the ring main unit, and very quickly we built adaptations within our software to be able to accommodate for some of the quirks that we see on the network. So key takeaway is really to confirm each link in the chain, and don't be afraid to, on a commercial side, when it comes to contracts, to actually negotiate on some of the specific clauses, which could be a barrier to signing a contract for an SME. And that, I think we'll just wrap up there. Thank you for your time.
Great, thanks, Sam. A really good overview there of what's been going on. Lots of lessons learned that we actually don't have time to cover in the session, but please do follow up with Sam after the webinar if you've got any questions for him. Okie dokie, on to our third speaker. So I'd like to introduce Christopher Jackson, who's Chief Executive Officer for Advanced Infrastructure Technology, who again have quite a different solution that they've been offering to the DNOs. Christopher, are you online and ready to go?
Ready to go.
Excellent, over to you then.
Afternoon, everybody. So just explaining who we are. Advanced Infrastructure is a data science and software engineering company based in the energy sector. And one of our flagship tools is Leap Plus, which is a digital solution that allows local authorities and distribution network operators to co-create their local area energy plans. Now, this is a benefit to the local authorities because they get to see distribution network data in greater detail than would otherwise be available, and also to get a digital support on the development of where they are deploying low carbon technologies. It's also a benefit to the distribution network operators because they get to identify and triage the maturity of the local authorities' energy projects, and then to resource them appropriately and plan for future investment. We are a company of just over 30 individuals and have been going for nearly 4 years now. If we jump to the next slide, well, just before we do, there's a screen capture of the tool that we use called Leap Plus, just so you can understand that it's essentially a geospatial information system, and also a number of digital workflows to guide the user through the siting of low carbon technology. Some of the functionality will also include the ability to make an automatic connection to the grid. But anyway, next slide, please. So I'm going to talk to you about what worked and what didn't. So these were essentially 3 pivots or 3 different products that we've been developing over the past 4 years, and 2 of them, one could say, failed, and the third one was successful. And I'm going to talk through why each one of them failed. So the first one on the left-hand side is a very granular carbon intensity map of electricity production by MSOA in the UK. So this is essentially a postcode carbon intensity map. Now, a free version of this service at 14 different regions exists in the UK, offered by National Grid, and it was our intention essentially to improve on the granularity of that, because we identified that businesses in the UK were either under-reporting or over-reporting their scope 2 carbon emissions from electricity because they were not taking into account the time of use and the location of use of electricity. So we thought it was a great value proposition, and we attempted to essentially sell this as an innovation project to the distribution network operators. And although we had some traction, we were sort of continually pushed back. And the reason was that although the innovation team found the project really innovative, the business sponsors didn't see a critical business need. So that meant that always the project was essentially getting pushed to the back of the queue. And it's interesting to understand that the real limiting factor on the amount of innovation projects that the distribution networks can do is not actually their available budget for innovation. It's the available capacity of the innovation managers and business sponsors to handle disruptive innovation projects, and better understanding the carbon consumption of electricity wasn't something that affected their business plans, and hence we were unable to get traction through the network innovation allowance or SIF mechanisms. The next project that was unsuccessful was demand modelling of UK building stock. Currently in the industry, most DNOs use a very crude sort of classification of domestic building energy consumption and assume that all of the 25 million domestic buildings have the same energy consumption profile. Which really is an artifact of the 1980s privatization of the energy market and is well out of date. So it was our intention to essentially build a better product that forecasts the energy of the half-hourly electricity consumption of each building in the UK to provide a much more granular a demand forecast. So we proposed this to a number of DNOs, but again, we're unsuccessful. And the reason for this is because there were other projects ongoing or had just been completed, which essentially covered this space. So our challenge there was convincingly explaining the uniqueness of this project and how it was different, and at the time we were unable to do that. So it's really important to understand the innovation landscape and projects that are ongoing or have recently been completed, and I'll talk later about ways in which you can do that. So the third sort of pivot and the third product that we landed upon was sort of combining all the knowledge that we had before and identifying essentially a digital product that helps with local area energy planning, which at that moment was a very hot topic. And we were just lucky because as the distribution network operators were just starting their next 5-year business period called Rio ED2. And they've just been given or rather lumbered with the obligation of supporting local authorities develop their local area energy plans, which had meant that most DNOs would have to resource a team of 20 to 30 engineers to work with the 100 or so local authorities in their license area. And this suddenly created a big cost center that the distribution network operators wanted to avoid. And we were fortunate in this instance that the market moved in our direction. And through the essentially the awareness and the engagement that we had ongoing with innovation project managers in the DNO, we were essentially scouted by one DNO in particular, and we essentially had to pitch and compete against a large nationwide consultancy that was the incumbent in the project, and demonstrate why our solution was better. So that finally led to our first network innovation allowance project, which was back in the end of midway in 2022. If we just jump over to the next slide, please. So there are sort of 3 tips I want to share with you that I found really valuable in this process. And I've essentially taken screenshots of them left to right. The first one is really, as I mentioned earlier, understand your innovation landscape. And the best way to do that is to use the Energy Network Association Smarter Networks portal, which is the screenshot on the left-hand side, in which you can search any previous NIA or SIF project. And this is valuable to both understand who led that project and in which DNO, who were the partners and what was their overall budget and what were the outputs and learnings. And I've always got a really good reception from the DNOs when I do that innovation landscaping for them, and they articulate why, and I articulate for them why it's different, because that's one of the screening criteria for new projects is to articulate the novelty and how it builds upon previous projects. The next bit of advice I'll give you is go to the Energy Innovation Summit 2023 this October in Liverpool. As a startup, you can have a discounted stall at the summit for I think around £600, which is truly a bargain. And it was thanks to going to this summit in 2021 that we were put on the radar for the DNO that eventually picked us for the Network Innovation Allowance project. So that was probably the best return on investment that we've ever made in terms of attending a conference. You really do get the time to speak one-to-one and demonstrate what you're doing. The third bit of advice I would give you is to understand and read the criteria for the Strategic Innovation Fund. There's a big long document called the SIF governance document, which really specifies how SIFs are assessed and what the criteria are, which is super important. I tend to find that a few of the innovation managers at DNOs actually haven't read this document, and reading it for them is a really beneficial thing to do. And the final point about the SIF, to just draw out the differences between the NIA and the SIF and how they're handled differently. Generally, or at least in the last round, distribution network operators each handled between 15 to 35 SIF discovery projects and really took a view of survival of the fittest. So they were very relaxed about supporting a project in the first round, and it was really up to that project team in the discovery phase to demonstrate your value and demonstrate that you can work together. And that's a really different approach from the Network Innovation Allowance, in which far fewer projects go ahead per year, but they're very much selective around making sure that it aligns with their business needs first before sponsoring it. So slight difference between how the NIA and the SIF is supported by the distribution network operators. That's all I have to say. Back to you, Laura.
Great. Thanks very much, Christopher. Cool. And just lastly on our agenda, over to Kate just to do a wrap up on how this fits in with the wider SIF programme.
Thanks, Laura. I'll try and keep this short and sharp. So I'm Kate Jones. I'm one of the innovation leads on the Strategic Innovation Fund. Just a reminder, we're short on time, so put your questions in the Q&A box and we will get back to you. I must say I've really enjoyed hearing from the innovators and getting this really valuable insight. So they've mentioned SIF throughout. So if we just go on to the next slide, please. So SIF has been mentioned throughout. It's a big pot of money to look at energy network innovation. We have an ideas process that you can submit some ideas through, where we'll help you pitch to the energy networks around a series of 4 challenges that we're publishing. So any projects that come through SIF, we work very closely with the innovators and the project to help them implement their solutions as quickly as possible. And we have a commercial team dedicated to this in the SIF team that will help those innovators to scale up. Just with the interest of time, if we skip on 2 slides, please. We've got 4 challenges out right now that we're looking for ideas for. These are on the screen. I'll drop a link and share it with everybody rather than going through it. But there's 4 ideas. We're looking for innovation across technical, social, regulation, innovation. So it's across the board that if you've got an idea that can address some of the challenges that are facing, we do want to hear from you. Next slide, please, Laura. So you can find out more about the challenges through this link. It was mentioned just then from Christopher. You'll find out all the details about the partner requirements and the types of solutions we're looking for. If you've got an idea now, we have a call for ideas process. It's just a super light form which you can suggest your project in the context of an energy network problem statement. And if you submit that through there, we'll help connect you to the right networks to potentially pitch your idea. Now that portal is open until the 21st of August, and that's the very last date for this year. If you ever want to find out about stuff that's going on, because we do a heap of activities, the best way to do that is through the SIF newsletter, which I've also got the link. Last slide, please, Laura, and we'll get hopefully 1 or 2 questions in. We've got 3 events left. These events are closing for registration by Thursday, if not before. 2 ideas workshops and 1 more webinar like this that's focusing all around the funding and support that we have available to you. I think I'll wrap up there and take some questions.
Thanks very much, Kate. A very speedy wrap up. Okay, so we've had a couple of questions coming in. I think we've just got time for one first one, which is directed towards Matthew. But all of our SME innovators, do feel free to chip in on this. So the question is, do you actively try to influence policy and regulation in the countries you'd like to operate in to help create a favourable market?
So I put one answer on the thread. So I mean, broadly, we try and understand what is the policy in those countries, and if it's still evolving. I think what we were also finding is the regulators and policymakers are keen to understand how the UK has developed its own policy. So sometimes we are essentially educating overseas policymakers about how they may want to encourage flexibility.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Christopher, Sam, any thoughts on, are you kind of directly engaging with policy regulation in this space, or you're just largely following where the market's going?
To the extent of which a small company can ever affect policy, we have responded to at least 2 Ofgem calls for evidence, which is a good way to speak with policymakers. The extent to which we have influence and change direction, can't say, but it's always useful to be involved in those conversations and to network with those who are responding.
And very briefly from my side, so I'm a very active member of an organisation called SIGRE, which is an international panel of experts across the distribution and the transmission space, and that's our vehicle really for being able to sow the seeds amongst other influential experts in various countries across the world.
Cool. Thanks very much, all of you. I think we are actually almost at time. There are a couple of other questions in the chat. If we've not had time to get to your question today, we will follow up with you directly via email. So thank you everyone for listening to this webinar, and to all of our speakers for participating. And just a quick heads up, we do have the last webinar in our series on Thursday. In Kate's slide pack, there is the link to that. So yeah, please tune in for that one, and look forward to seeing you there. Thanks everyone.